Welcome to Mark's Murder Mystery Monday.
Yeah, and she's here with a guest, Courtney, everyone. Wow, that was loud. Welcome, Courtney. Hi. So, Courtney, you have with you a special guest today. You were quite excited to get this guy.
Guest.
Yeah.
Yes, I am a huge fan, huge fan. And just saw that he was doing a podcast and thought it would be incredible to have him on the show.
He does a true crime podcast.
Yeah.
Tony, can you hear Courtney okay, or what seems to be the problem? Are you all right? Before I bring Steve on?
Yeah.
Tony?
She sounds fine. She sounds okay.
Okay, fine. Okay. You had that
So far,
look on
it
your
sounds
face
okay.
that maybe there was a problem.
No.
What's that?
She's a bit low at first, but she sounded okay now. She sounds okay
Okay,
now.
she sounds
great.
okay.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay. Now, I'm sorry to interrupt Steve's introduction, please. So go ahead. Who is he?
Oh, well, we're so lucky we have Steve Gregory on this morning.
Steve, well, that was not sorry, Steve. I was going to mention Golden Mike winner, true crime expert. He's hip deep in law enforcement with a number of contacts.
He's had dozens of Golden Mike
The
awards.
dude has
Yes.
literally so many Golden Mikes that he
Associated
could
Press
pave his
Awards,
front
yeah.
walk
I
with
know.
Golden Mike awards.
Edward Murrow Awards. Yeah. I
He's
know,
the real deal.
extraordinary.
Steve, we love having you here. Thanks for taking a minute.
Good to see you, Marco. Hi, Courtney.
Hi. Thank you for being here. We're
Steve,
so lucky to have you.
Are you on a stakeout right now, Steve?
You know, here's the crazy thing. I almost had to cancel today because we had a big breaking news story. I think you've heard the news about the bishop of the archbishop,
Yes.
excuse me, the bishop of the archdiocese here in LA murdered. Well, they've announced an arrest. I'm at the Hall of Justice now, downtown Los Angeles, where the sheriff's about to announce the details having to do with that case.
Oh, wow.
That you're right. I mean, and that was a mystery when it first was released, the information yesterday, because they were saying so little about it. I mean, we didn't even, and there was no information around it. So now they are making an arrest. Okay.
Well, the arrest has been made, and the reason they were sort of tight-lipped around it is because they were surveilling the guy and eventually found him down in Torrance, but they were doing surveillance on him, and they have to be very careful with what they let out because they don't want to tip off the suspected shooter, and that person could escape, go to another country, or whatever the case is. So they have to tread very lightly until they're absolutely sure they can get him.
I see. Yeah, makes sense. So what do you have today, Courtney? What are you and Steve featuring?
Well, we wanted to talk about the podcast that Steve is the host and executive producer for.
And what's that called?
It's called Unsolved with Steve Gregory.
Yeah.
Yes. And so I've been a fan of KFI for a very long time, but an even bigger fan of Steve. And I know that Steve has spent most of his career in investigative journalism. So it's great to see that he has this podcast, which I don't want to speak for him, but was created to serve for those cases that are unsolved. And so I can let Steve talk about it a little bit more, but of course, Steve is on KFI as well. So
yeah, KFI is a radio station, a huge radio station in Los Angeles. Go ahead, Steve. Talk about your show, and then we're going to talk about this particular case.
Sure. The show was born from a segment I did on a midday talk show, the Gary and Shannon show. They had me come on to talk about this cold case that I was covering. And the response from the audience was so overwhelming that we were kind of kicking it around. It was kind of a joke that maybe we should do a show about cold cases. And with my plate being so full, I just wasn't that interested in doing it. Well, management really kind of pressured me into it. So they had an opening on Saturday nights. So we did it. Then, of course, we also do the podcast platform part of it. And then it took off. And from then we developed the show into seasons just to keep track of all the cases. So we're in the middle of our fourth season right now. And we do cases from the LA County Sheriff's Department, LAPD, the Pomona Police Department, San Bernardino Sheriff's Department, Riverside PD, all over Southern California, rather. But one of the cool things that we're doing now is that the radio show is going to stay hyper local, but the podcast will now segue into doing cases around the world. So we're going to be doing cases from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We've got cases coming out of Arizona, and we may even have an unsolved case coming out of Dubai in the very near future.
Wow.
So we're going to be featuring unsolved cases from all over the planet on the podcast platform.
You'll be traveling all over the planet. Does that mean, Steve Gregory?
Well, if I had the kind of budget to do that, I would certainly be traveling all over the planet. But thank God for Zoom, because we'll be doing an awful lot of these remotely.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrific. I mean, it really is great, the degree to which it's achieved the kind of popularity that allows you to expand its reach. So, Courtney, what is the story today? What are you and Steve talking about today? Because this is a crime, and I know a murder that was featured on Steve's podcast, which is one of the reasons you felt he would be a great guest today.
Yes, yes. Well, there were two stories really. The first was the very first episode of the podcast. I was really compelled by the story, which was the one that you teased, which was a father-son duo where the father was driving the son to commit the crimes, which I thought was very interesting. And then there was the most recent podcast that aired on Saturday, Yelani Uyoa, her unsolved crimes. So maybe we can touch on the Anthony and Manuel Velasquez crime, which happened, I believe the murder started in 2014, right, Steve?
Yeah. So what basically happened is this guy was killing others, and they were trying to figure out what the connection, if any, might have been. Well, come to find out, he had killed 2 men and 1 woman. The woman he had killed apparently had a romantic connection to the other 2 men. Well, then what connected all of them even further were drugs. Well, at least the woman was homeless at the time, and there's surveillance footage of this guy, Velasquez, going in to the tent in East Los Angeles and actually putting a gun inside the tent and opening fire and killing the woman inside the tent.
Apparently, that's not this picture. That's the next picture. The next picture, please, Tony.
Yeah. Oh, next picture.
Next picture
is
again.
the
Sorry.
Surveillance.
The surveillance shot, apparently.
So that was the PT Cruiser that was really sort of, it really stuck out because it's an unusual looking car. And what they found out was this guy didn't have a license. And so the father was driving him from murder scene to murder scene. He killed 3 people over 4 years. And he was nestled in this really nondescript house in East Los Angeles. And the benefit of my relationships with the sheriff's department were such that I got a call about the case back when they were still trying to piece it together. So my very first episode of Unsolved literally talks about a case from the beginning to the end. So we actually solved the case, but I wanted to take the listener on that journey from what it was like to get information about the case first, and then push it all the way up to where I was exclusively allowed with the sheriff's department SWAT team to go in on the raid that morning and arrest Velasquez and his father. Now the footage that I prominently, and I know those are stills there, but there's some footage that's prominently displayed on my TikTok. I think is where I have it. Steve Gregory 818 on TikTok. There's footage of me. That picture you see of Velasquez on the left there, you see me walking with him in handcuffs, and I ask him why he killed those people, and his response is pretty classic. So I actually talk with him as he's being led to the car and into the vehicle, and then the announcement of the charges. So we got to take the listener on the journey from the murders that were committed, why they were committed, the person of interest, which became the suspect, the weird twist with the father, and then the conclusion of the case. And now it's obviously sitting in the criminal courts.
Well, what? So Steve's not going to tell us what the guy said to him. I mean, I'll listen to the podcast.
You got to go to TikTok. If you go to TikTok, Steve Gregory 818.
You got to go to TikTok. The one thing I never want to hear on this show is you got to go to TikTok.
That's not fake. That's real.
The reporting is incredible. I mean, you're there with Steve as they are arresting these 2 men. It's extraordinary.
All right.
Yeah.
So Unsolved is the name of the podcast.
Yes,
it's Unsolved with Steve
Unsolved.
Gregory.
Yes.
Go ahead. Anyway, so the picture that we're seeing now on YouTube, on the guy on the right is the father who drove the son to various murders because the son didn't have the driver's license.
For one of the crimes in a PT Cruiser, might be added. Yeah.
But I thought one of the other things that was interesting about this case was that the reason that the apprehension actually happened as quickly as it did, or when it did, was because there was reaching out to the community, wasn't there? They ID'd the car and all that sort of thing.
Yep.
And
there was that's a really good point, Mark, because that was really an example that illustrates how community policing works, because they got the description, and Courtney had that up there, the sketches of the 2. The pictures of those sketches were put on bulletins and on flyers, and they were hand delivered to all the homes in East LA. Now keep in mind, they had already suspected who this guy was based on confidential informant information and other sources. What they needed to do was get confirmation. So they handed these flyers out strategically to homes around the area where they knew this guy lived. And so when they did that, they got a flood of phone calls from residents, from neighbors. And the reason they had never come forward before is because this son and father had basically ruled that neighborhood with an iron fist, and they were all afraid of him. And the kid was known to stab people's tires, vandalize vehicles and doors. So they were all very afraid of him. So when they came forward anonymously and told him what had happened, they knew they had their guy. Now, interestingly, the morning of the arrest, because we had to see my call time for roll call was at 3:00 in the morning. And then I drove in a convoy with the SWAT vehicles to the location. Then they had a van there with, wires and bars on the side of the glass. They bring the father in first, and then they bring the son in, and they sit him in that van, and they just sat there. And I asked the investigator, I said, well, what's going on now? Aren't you going to take him anywhere? And he goes, no, we're letting him sit in there and stew. I said, what do you mean let him sit in there and stew? And he goes, that's where we get our best intel. They don't know we're recording, and they're in there talking. And so that's how they got a lot of intel, because those two were sitting in the van talking and complaining back and forth.
This is the stuff that you do have, which is really cool. The sort of the methods and strategies that law enforcement uses. It's fascinating, and that's one of them.
There was, I think there was, or if I remember correctly, there was a woman that you were interviewing in the neighborhood, and she was like, we saw the flyers, we saw the silver PT Cruiser. It's hard not to assume it's them.
Right, exactly.
Like them.
Yeah, the flyers, they were really good. The sketches were excellent.
It's like, at some point, it's your neighbor.
Yeah, but they never came forward before. Yep. They knew these guys were into bad stuff, but no one ever came forward for fear of retaliation.
Yeah, Kim saying it's strange that the dad drove the son to the murder scenes because the son didn't have a license. That's really the lawyer concerned about braking while you're on your way to a murder?
It's true. It's true.
The other thing that people are saying, just so you know, is that my audience is saying we're never going to TikTok. Oh, we did go to TikTok for everybody.
Oh,
come on.
There you go.
Everybody's saying we're not going to TikTok, Mark. We're not going to TikTok. Screw that. We're not doing TikTok. Well, here it is. Here's the answer. And this is Steve's moment with the perpetrator. Thank you, Tony, for grabbing this for us. So we'll.
Thanks, Tony.
Why'd you kill those people?
Excuse me, sir?
Why'd you kill them?
Could have asked him about those tattoos, what was running through his mind when he got those, Steve. But I get you.
Well, the reaction, that's why I didn't want to give away the reaction, because he never said anything to me. He rolled his eyes and just gave a real sarcastic smirk to me. And it's funny because detectives, when they saw that video, because that video aired on every television station that night, because I was the only one that was there. So all the TV stations reached out to me for that footage, and I gave them permission. But the detectives were laughing because they said, no one had ever really asked anyone that point blank, but the response of him rolling his eyes and turning his face like that, like, really, like, you're going to ask me that right here? The detectives thought that was hilarious.
What was there any kind of relationship between this guy and his victims or not?
Well, the only relationship was between the woman. We were told that he had a romantic relationship with the woman at one time. And then we were told loosely that the relationship with the other guys had something to do with drug dealing, and there were drugs involved. It was apparent, or suggested to me, that Anthony Velasquez was dealing drugs and that the guys were buying from him. So there was some sort of a weird sort of triangle there between the three people.
Wow. It's wild. Yeah, I wouldn't make fun of his body ink, while but I just feel as though it was strange. Somebody in the chat was saying, be careful, of making fun. But for those listening, he had Los Angeles on his back, and on his front, I don't know what it said, but something, it was also very prominent. He really committed to body art, which is, I got to give him that.
Yeah.
But
part of the police sketch and part of what they put out to the public in the search of these two suspects was the neck tattoo. that he had
Oh, wow.
as a
Right.
distinguishing characteristic.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Yeah.
So
So actually, in the end,
in the
look,
end,
between the PT Cruiser
Yeah.
and a prominent neck tattoo, I mean, the guy is pretty much,
you're not hiding out.
Yeah,
with
there
that,
it is.
Yeah.
Possible driver. of
If
the
you
PT.
go down one, Tony, I think you should maybe go. That's his father dropping him off. That's his father in the PT Cruiser. If you go down one more, I think you'll see the victims. Yeah. So these are the three victims. Mm-hmm. Well, I can't thank you enough, Steve, for coming
so that's
on.
Nikki,
Yeah,
Nick, the victims' names.
great.
I was just going to read their names, but
okay.
but now they're gone. Nikki Lopez, Eduardo Robles, and Jesse Avalos.
Yeah.
God, that's just brutal.
Yeah.
Brutal.
Yeah, it's just awful. I'm grateful that you came on. It was so nice to chat with you. And there is a new story as of Saturday. So I've been listening to it. It's extraordinary reporting. When I spoke with you, you were going down to speak with the detectives, right? Or the investigators on there?
Yeah, you're talking about Yaneli Iota, the 15-year-old girl found stuffed into the BMW trunk. And this was a heartbreaking story because at 15 years old, she had a 14-month-old son. I'm sorry, daughter. She had a 14-month-old daughter, and she was 15. So she had a child at 14. And so she had a really tough childhood. And she was in the summer of 05, her body sat in that trunk, laid in that trunk for almost 5 days in brutal heat before someone finally realized there was a stench coming from the trunk. And when they got a locksmith there to open it, they found her body inside that had been horribly decomposed. And when they start backtracking the clues on the case, they find out she'd been dating someone that was older, and that person and his family escaped to Mexico pretty much that day, and they were unable to track him down. So to this day, they're looking for the brother of the suspected killer. And I interviewed also her brother, Ray Iota, and had a really nice chat with him about their relationship together and who he thinks actually killed her. So that was this past weekend's edition.
Yes. Tony, if you go to the next slide, this was her boyfriend at the time, correct? Jose Gonzalez. Granados, yeah. And he, it was his car. It was his stepfather's car that his stepfather had given to him, and that is how they found him, correct?
Right. So they believe, actually, they believe Jose Granados is dead. They had heard rumor that he was probably killed by a cartel in Mexico. So they're looking for his brother, Francisco Granados, because he was actually what they characterized as sort of the straight-laced member of the family. He was in college. He was about to go into the military. He was responsible, and they're hoping he's going to be able to shed light on it. They just need some closure and comfort for the family at this point.
Boy,
wow.
So it's a lot of sadness wrapped into a lot of these stories, but you do want some sliver of justice, which is pretty much all you can hope for,
Yep.
But pal, so appreciate you coming through. You're just
of course,
such
Mark.
a great journalist, and you have such a great connect with law enforcement and so many of the things that are going on in Southern California and beyond, as we learned. So let's talk again. Please come visit anytime. Steve Gregory.
My pleasure.
And again, it's Unsolved with Steve Gregory, the podcast. Subscribe.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tony. Bye, guys.
Yeah. All right.
Mark's Murder Mystery Monday on the Mark Thompson Show.
Yeah. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.